Howdy y'all. Now, picture this. You're in Tokyo back in 1954, having just walked out of a showing of Toho's latest masterpiece, Godzilla, and you're simply blown away by what you've just watched, adoring the film so much that you try to catch every showing afterwards until the film is ultimately pulled from theaters. And after that, you patiently wait for the film to be released on home media so that you can continue watching it on your television. But that's when you remembered. Home media hasn't been invented yet, and wouldn't even become practical for like another 30 years! Whatever are you going to do? Godzilla has become one of your favorite films of all time, and you have no way to enjoy it again. Well, fret not. For even though you can't watch the movie, you can settle for the next best thing. The movie's novelization. Okay, I'm sure I don't need to explain what film novelizations are or why they were a thing in the first place, but just in case, here's an oversimplified overview. Before home media was invented, studios hired out novelists to crank out novelizations of their films for people who wanted to relive their favorite movies. It should be noted that these were almost never one-to-one copies of the films they're based on. Much in the same way where a movie has to make changes when it's adapting a novel has to make changes when it's adapting a movie. Novelizations were a compromise to be sure, but a welcomed one. Of course though, after home media became a viable option, novelizations became a lot less popular. Instead of reading an adapted version of their favorite film, people could simply watch their favorite film instead. With all that said, however, novelizations are still being released in some capacity to this very day, which is honestly surprising, but I suppose that's a video for another time. Getting back to the original point, a lot of movies used to have novelizations written for them, and Godzilla Raids Again were no different. Released as two short novellas in a single book, this release sought to give the people back at home a way to re-experience these films, without the proper way to re-watch said films. For the longest time, these novelizations were only available in Japan. The translation I'm holding right now has only been in print since late 2023. It took nearly 70 years for the novelization of one of the most famous films of all time to get translated into English, which okay, honestly makes sense. Believe it or not, it took a full 50 years for the original cut of Godzilla to release outside of Japan. Before that, it was only the version with Raymond Burr that was widely available everywhere else. It's really not that big of a surprise that it took so long for the novelizations to make their way on over as well. But now that it is available in English, and I finally got my hands on a copy, let's go through these novellas and see how they differ from the films they're based on. Well, let's go ahead and start off with the first one, Godzilla. One thing that struck me about this novel right off the bat was how much more directly it made Godzilla out to be an allegory for atomic weapons. And by that, I mean it literally opens with a note from the author pleading the reader to view Godzilla as a metaphor for atomic weapons. Now, it's no secret that Godzilla, as he originally was in the first film, was an embodiment of the looming threat of nuclear weaponry. Though the film is still subtle enough with its messaging that it's still possible for you to view him as something else. He could be the embodiment of atomic weapons, a metaphor for natural disasters, the folly of man in general, or, simply be a gigantic monster running amok. Like all great art, Godzilla does have its own intended message, but allows you to have your own reading of its material as well. The novelization, putting it bluntly, is not quite as subtle. Not only does it open with this plea for you to view the story in the way the author intended it, but at one point the characters directly compare him to nuclear weapons. If anything, Godzilla himself is the hydrogen bomb hanging over Japan right now. As if it already wasn't obvious enough how we were supposed to view him in the first place. I know I'm starting off rather negative, but seeing how this is literally the first page of the book, I couldn't not bring it up first. But let's skip into the actual story. In the first few pages, the book goes over the scene of the fishing boat being attacked by Godzilla. Unlike its movie counterpart, however, the novella actually gives character to some of the fishermen here. focusing on two specifically,
Takeo
and
Saburo,
describing them as two boys fresh out of high school. It even mentions that the boat is coming back from its journey and was close to harbor when Godzilla attacked, just so you feel all the worse seeing them all die here. Okay, to be serious for a moment, I actually really like these additions. Now for the film, it works perfectly fine enough just to show a group of people die in a mysterious, horrifying way. In fact, I would even go to say it may have been a little clunky if the film had tried to characterize any of them right before the disaster. But in the medium of novels, you're able to more freely flesh out minor details without it seeming distracting. So I'm glad to see the novel expanded on this aspect of the story. Makes it more impactful than it would have been if it was just a one-to-one version of the original scene. The novel then continues the plot from there, and we reach probably the biggest change from movie to novel overall. Okay, now, remember the character Ogata from the film? How he was Emiko's main love interest and debatably the main character of the movie as well? You do? Good. Now, do you remember the character Shinsuke? The boy who was orphaned on Odo Island after his family was killed by Godzilla, so the Yamane family adopted him. You remember that too? Great. In the novel, they're the same character, just called Shinsuke, so I get to mispronounce it throughout the rest of the video. He still starts out the story as working for Tokyo Bay Rescue and Salvage Company, but when the Godzilla attacks start near Odo Island, he travels over there to make sure his mother and brother are okay. His brother being Majesty, the only surviving fisherman from Godzilla's attacks. Shinsuke then watches as his mother and brother are trampled by Godzilla, and then he goes back to the mainland to, more or less, play out Ogata's purpose in the story from there. Speaking of Ogata, he's technically in the book as well. He's actually the president of Tokyo Bay and Rescue. But aside from that, he's nothing more than a side character that only appears in a handful of scenes. And I also like this change here. Being completely honest, I've always found Ogata to be the most boring character in the film. He's technically the main character, I know, but he's never felt that way to me. Shirazawa, Emiko, and Dr. Yame are far more interesting in their personalities, actions, and struggles that they go throughout the story. Granted, I don't find that a bad thing in the film per se. With so many great characters, someone was bound to get the short end of the stick. And with Shinsuke in the film, I always found him to be so underutilized. This man just watched his family be crushed to death, and we just don't have any insight on how he feels throughout the rest of the runtime. I swear, the first couple of times I watched Godzilla, I didn't even recognize the fact that he was adopted by the Yamane family. It's not like the film ever has a scene where they're taking him in or anything. He's just kinda there at the dinner table. So I really like how the novelization sorta merges these two together. It helps in making Ogata, or rather Shinsuke, more interesting by having him being the one watch his mother and brother die, and then go on throughout the rest of the story burdened by the weight of what he saw. I do think the novel should have cut out Ogata altogether, seeing how he has such an inconsequential role here, but overall, I do think it handles these characters better than the film. There is one problem that results from this, however. See, you have Shinsuke at the fishing headquarters, seeing the initial Godzilla attacks as they unfold, and, well, let me just read it for you. When Shinsuke, a native of Odo Island, heard that the fishing boat had met the same fate, he became anxious. Was it my family? He got permission from the president of the company, then hastily set out to return home to the island. Cream-colored evening primroses were blooming profusely. No, excuse me. How, sir? How did you get from mainland Japan over to Odo Island so fast? Did you go by plane? Cause if you did, the book sure didn't mention it. Did you go by boat? Cause that may cause a bit of a problem for you. You know, seeing how it's Godzilla-infested waters at the moment. It's a minor thing to complain about, I know, but it irks me how this paragraph tries to gloss over how he supposedly got from one place to another. It really reads like he just teleported from one location to the next. Getting back to the plot, the rest of the story plays out just like the films, with some minor details changed here and there. It's made more clear that the inhabitants of Odo Island use Godzilla as a sort of urban legend to scare the children into behaving well. And during the scenes on the island, the newspaperman is shown to be a real jerk, who constantly disbelieves what what they say, and even laughs at the ritual dances. Oh, by the way, here, during the ritual, the islanders are dressed as lions, not whatever this was in the movie. Later on, when everyone comes to examine the island, there's a somber scene of Shigeru walking through the gravesite of his mother and brother, with Emiko watching from a distance. And a little after that, when Godzilla first appears, he has a dead cow hanging from his mouth, which was actually a cut concept from the film because they couldn't get the proportions right. So it's great to see it utilized here. He then picks up a young girl, and it's made clear that he's about to reach for Emiko as well, but Shigeru saves her life just in the nick of time. Now that I think about it, I guess the original scene was also trying to convey that, though it was just really hindered by the effects of the time. Really hindered. Right after everyone gets back to the mainland, there's a small scene with the main cast trying to convince Serizawa to make his research public, thinking that it may help them with their little monster problem. Now this actually was a deleted scene from the film, and I see why it was deleted. It's entirely pointless, and it doesn't really make much sense here. How would the others even know that his research would have anything to do with anything that could help them get rid of Godzilla? It's also a very short scene too. If it was filmed, I couldn't imagine it would be longer than like 3 minutes tops. The film made the right call to cut it, and the book should have done the same. The book makes the same embarrassing mistake the film did in saying that the Jurassic period was only 2 million years ago. How do you make that mistake twice? After the court hearing, when Godzilla is made known to the public, there's another scene to go along the train one with the 3 young adults, with 2 students wondering what's going to happen to Japan now that they have a monster to deal with. This scene accomplishes the same thing as the train one, just showing off the public's reaction to the kaiju. It is kind of pointless in that regard, but I'm still going to give some points to the novelization for expanding the story in a natural way. The Yamane family is said to have a maid here. She's a pointless character. In fact, I'm not even sure if she really counts as a character. I genuinely can't remember if she ever said anything, but she's there. Okay, getting back to the Big G for a moment, in all of his scenes here, he's described as having a white light emanating from him at all times. Undoubtedly an effect from all the radiation he's endured. It's a nice touch. It helps in illustrating just how much of a unique threat Godzilla truly is. But then, after he retreats back into the ocean after wreaking havoc on some trains, something happens in the story that really threw me for a loop while reading. Shigeru gets a note from someone and, well, let me just read it to ya. To Mitsuko, Godzilla killed your older brother. However, that was not without reason. If you hate Godzilla for killing your brother and you want Godzilla to die too, then you will likely befall the same fate as your brother. What do you say? Are you prepared for that? Our great leader, the great Lord Godzilla, will probably be back tomorrow night to stir up the weak-kneed, cowardly people of our nation. Signed, the Tokyo Godzilla Society. Yeah, this Tokyo Godzilla Society springs up out of nowhere and starts sending threatening messages to people all across the country, warning them that Godzilla will have them killed if they do not abide by his will. Which leads many people to speculate that the Big G is actually a gigantic robot. And people further speculate that Dr. Yamane is the one behind the secret society, because of how openly opposed he is to the idea of killing the monster. Now, in case you didn't know, it was a cut concept from the original film that Dr. Yamane would be a more antagonistic character. He was actually supposed to sabotage some efforts to destroy Godzilla in order to save the kaiju. I can only imagine that his role would have been similar to Dr. Keratin's from The Thing from Another World, but anyway, the movie decided against that, and made Dr. Yamane a less cliched evil scientist, and wisely decided to turn him into a more nuanced character instead. So, when I started getting into these scenes from the book, I really thought the novelization was going to bring that cut concept back to life. I was kind of getting excited. I was really hoping in the final pages Dr. Yamane was going to be revealed as being behind the whole thing from the start. And the book really seemed to be hinting at that ending as well. After Godzilla's second attack on Japan, when everyone is mourning and in shock after what happened to their city, he just mysteriously vanished vanishes. So I was really looking forward to what I thought was going to be the biggest deviation from the source material. But nope, Dr. Yamane appears at the end of the story like normal, and gives his speech about another monster appearing if nuclear tests are continued. It really feels like the writer here wanted to make him the main villain through the story, but realized he couldn't deviate that much from the movie, so he just gave up on that twist at the very end, and had the Doctor act like his film counterpart instead. Now, you may be asking, dear viewer, if Dr. Yamane is perfectly innocent, then who was behind the Godzilla Tokyo Society? One guy. Yep. It was just one random, nameless guy who was just handing out all of those letters, scaring people for his own sick kicks. He's not even named in the story. The military just finds his crushed corpse in the aftermath of one of the attacks, with his pockets filled with even more demented posters, urging people to submit to the kaiju. This is such a big aspect of the second half of the story, and it's all just swept aside in the last 10 pages of the book. The whole subplot was entirely pointless. I don't know if this was a cut concept from the film as well, but if it was, I see why it was cut. The story makes you think that maybe some underground society was organizing the attacks, only to say gotcha right when you're practically finished with the book. If I didn't know any better, I would say this was only added to pad out the length. Actually, I don't know any better. The novelization is barely over 100 pages. This Godzilla Tokyo Society may have literally only been added to fill out the plot. And, at the risk of padding out this video, I'm gonna stop talking about this aspect of the story. After all of that, the story does conclude like it does in the film. Emiko and Shinsuke convince Shirazawa to use the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla, with the aid of the choir of children singing out the prayer for peace. Although here I want to mention, while Shinsuke does bleed from the head like in the film, here it's because Shirazawa swung an axe at his head and just barely missed. Which, okay, I guess technically that could have been what happened in the film as well, but it's all off screen, so we're not going to count it there. And then the story concludes with Godzilla being killed by the oxygen destroyer, Shirazawa staying at the bottom of the ocean so that his weapon of mass destruction dies with him. The final page actually includes the reprise of the prayer for peace, though of course written down in poetry form here. And that's the end of the first novelization. Now let's go ahead and jump into the sequel novelization, Godzilla Raids Again. I've actually already made a video about this movie, and that, for some reason, became my most watched upload by far. I'm just hoping this video can be half that lucky. Anyway, jumping into its book counterpart, in the scene where Kobayashi and Tsukioka have their encounter with Godzilla, instead of the big G just awkwardly standing to the side in a not well thought out compositing effect, here the kaiju is actively trying to reach the two men, clawing away at the surface of the rock to reach them inside of a small clearing that they have taken shelter inside of. During this part, Tsukioka, presumably accepting his fate, lights a cigarette and offers one to Kobayashi. This is actually the reason Kobayashi calls Tsukioka so brave later on, which actually makes sense. Now that I think about it, in the film he was shown to be just as scared as Kobayashi, so I don't really know why Kobayashi would have complimented him on his courage there. Anyway, Godzilla is just about to reach them, and he would have too if it wasn't for Anguirus walking to the island right at that very moment. Yeah, the scene here plays out like a lot of other scenes that we've seen in monster films. I guess technically that makes this a really early example of this trope, so I have to give it some props for that. I imagine even if the filmmakers wanted to shoot it that way, the limitations of 1950s effects would have made that virtually impossible, especially when you consider the admittedly rushed production of the film. Anyways, it's nice that the novelization added some suspense to the scene in a way the film didn't. Although the book is admittedly less exciting in how the monsters exit the scene. In the film, the two get into a scuffle and topple over the edge of the island, splashing down into the water below. Here, though, they just jump into the water one after another after Anguirus shows how yellow he is. After the two kaiju exit stage right, there's also an additional scene of the two main characters escaping the island via Tsukayoka's airplane, unlike the film where it just jump cuts to the scientists without showing them escape. Speaking of the scientists, Dr. Yamane also returns to make his little cameo here, and funnily enough, he even brought his copy of the first film along too. Even though this is a novelization, it still includes the scene of everyone watching footage from the first movie. Honestly, probably a case of the novelization sticking a little too close to the source material. After the film is over, Dr. Yamane goes on to describe Godzilla's attraction to lights. So, much like its film counterpart, the book retcons a weakness into the kaiju that wasn't there originally. Skipping a bit, the book includes the part where Godzilla turns away so everyone thinks they're safe, only for him to turn right back round to the mainland. Although here the turnaround is even quicker, with less than a page dedicated to people thinking they're safe from the kaiju. Granted, at least the novel doesn't have people celebrate the disappearance of Godzilla. Hidema and Tsukayaka are just out shopping when the evacuation starts, not dancing their hearts out. Aw, heck yeah, someone else is gonna die instead of me, let's boogie. Then you have Godzilla reach the shoreline, the military lure him away with the flares, and then all of the prisoners make a big oopsie and draw the kaiju back. I find it a little odd how the novelization didn't give the prisoners any names or personalities. To me, that would have been the perfect place to expand the story slightly. Kinda like how the first novella gave some character to the people on the Lucky Dragon number, Ieko Mari in its opening scene. Though that's admittedly a bit of a nitpick. The whole scene is still a Diabolus Ex Machina no matter how you cut it. With that, Godzilla turns back to the mainland, with Anguirus appearing right behind him. The novel actually has them fighting before they fully reach the shoreline. And surprisingly enough, Anguirus here is also depicted as having atomic breath himself. But atomic breath or not, Godzilla still emerges as the champion, killing off his opponent. The novelization has him die right after the two fall through Osaka Castle. It cuts out the part where Godzilla bites down on Anguirus' neck. I find it funny how even the novelization recognized how weirdly graphic that part was, and decided to cut it out altogether. And from there, the book plays out almost exactly like the film, with some minor changes that aren't really worth talking about. But there are still some things I want to mention. In the scene where Hidema tells her father, the president of the fishery, about Kobayashi's death, instead of simply walking back on her own after a few seconds, here her father yells at her to get back to work as she's actively crying about the loss of her friend. At least he doesn't treat her differently because she's his daughter, I guess? And there's something else that I'm gonna have to give more context on. Throughout the story, Kobayashi has been on the lookout for a wife, and has a picture in his wallet of the girl he's going to marry. Now, in my original video, I said that this was a picture of Hidema, and I went over the implications of this being a picture of Hidema. I thought this was a picture of Hidema because when I looked it up, plot summaries of the film said it was a picture of Hidema. This is not a picture of Hidema. It's just a picture of some random girl that's not even in the story. And when I say some random girl, I mean it. The novelization doesn't even give her a name. And the novelization hints at the fact that she's on the younger side? So tell me, how old is this girl? He was on the verge of making a careless mistake. Goodness, I'm afraid I can't say. I'm in dangerous waters here. Well, I'm glad you died. For the life of me, I don't know if this was a change the novelization made, or if this was always just supposed to be some random girl in the film. If it's the former, then everything I said in my original video still applies here. If it's the latter, then it's bad storytelling for entirely different reasons. You can't have a relationship in which one character is just straight up not in the story. story. For all we know, this isn't even someone Kobayashi has met. You kinda just have to take him at his word when he says it's someone he's going to marry. This could legitimately just be a picture he found somewhere that he's managed to grow a parasocial relationship with just by looking at it. But even assuming this is someone he knows and loves, it's still just a cheap way to have the reader grow sympathetic towards him right before he dies. But that's getting into stuff I already mentioned in that previous video, so I'll just leave it at that for now. The rest are soon able to trap Godzilla in with the ice, with the book including another reprise of the prayer for peace in written form, which is a little odd here considering how there is no prayer scene like in the first novel, but I'll give it a pass for artistic license, I guess. And yeah, that's all major things to note about both novellas, though there are still few things I wanted to mention at the very end. First of all, I find it kind of funny how the translation doesn't translate the word kaiju. In case you don't know, kaiju is not really a word in the English language. It literally means strange beast, though it's often translated to just monster. Now, granted, thanks to the success of the Godzilla movies, kaiju is a word that most fans of the series will recognize. I dare say anyone who's even slightly interested in reading these novelizations will know what it means no problem. So it's not a big deal or anything, just something I found a little funny. Also, I know I've been using kaiju throughout this review, so it's not like I'm one to talk. Although, it does make me question why he decided to leave kaiju untouched, though decided anyway to use Godzilla instead of the original spelling of Gojira. You'd think that with that same logic, you would also want to keep the original spelling of the titular monster. Okay, I know the reason why he used the English spelling here, to ensure the fact that the translated novelization would have a decent chance of selling well. Also, Godzilla is just a cooler name than Gojira. Yeah, I said it! Okay, setting aside the translated aspect of it, there are a few things I also wanted to bring up about the actual book itself. For one, I noticed that sometimes the story will break away from the narratives to speak directly to the viewer to explain something. The radios were still blaring as the rooftop police stations and city hall sirens also started going off. Some of you readers probably know how weird and unsettling it can be when terrified people are running around in a panic as sirens wail overhead. High and low, their trailing noise reverberated across the landscape. The continuous, drawn-out sounds of the sirens coming from every direction sounded like sobbing. Godzilla grew even more enraged. He spat out another strong, white-hot beam as he pushed forward, trampling every building in his path. He was headed towards Ginza. Dear readers, I imagine you must be familiar with the weapon known as a flamethrower. You've probably seen them in newsreels at the cinema, in American movies, and so on. Soldiers use it when they suspect the enemy is hidden away in a building or some such place. The soldier aims what looks like a rifle and a great stream of fire shoots out from its mouth, incinerating everything for 15 or 16 meters. That's a terrifying weapon, I mean. The white-hot column of fire shooting out of Godzilla's mouth was hundreds of times stronger than any flamethrower. It doesn't happen that often, but even if it just happened once, that still would have been pretty odd. You don't get to pick and choose which perspective you want to write in the middle of a book. That's just lazy storytelling. Another aspect of the writing here is just how one-to-one these books are sometimes with the films. There are several times throughout these where they not only describe scenes from the movie, but they also cut from scene to scene in the exact same way the film did as well. Fire was spewing from the windows on the upper floors. Far beneath that, a mother huddled with her children by the ground floor entrance. She held her 3 children tight by her side and whispered whitely as the sparks rained down all around them. She added, but I suppose that even if they did, no one would want to eat the fish from here anyway. At this comment, everyone let out a small, uncomfortable burst of laughter. In the evening papers that day, the large headlines read, "Did Godzilla miss? Osaka and Kobe breathe a sigh of relief. I'm so sorry if that's not pronounced Kobe, that's what it looks like. Sometimes I swear it didn't feel like I was reading a novelization, but just an inaccurate recap of the films. Which is weird when you consider who wrote them in the first place. None other than Shigeru Kayama wrote the novelizations for both movies. Now, that name may not ring a bell to you, but he's the guy who wrote the original treatments for Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again. The ones that the scriptwriters would later refine to make a proper script out of. So, if you look at it in kind of a slanted view, these novelizations are an adaptation of his original stories. That's pretty neat. That fact alone makes these more special than other novelizations that were just written by writers for hire. And he also wrote these for younger readers, which admittedly kind of explains some of the weirder writing choices I talked about earlier. Okay, now that really is all I wanted to mention about these novellas. Can I recommend them? Only if you're a big fan of these films to begin with. It's interesting to see some of the changes made to the stories here, some of them admittedly being for the best, but all of that's weighed down by just how short these books are. The first one is only 105 pages long, and the second one is a measly 73 pages in length. And when you read them, you understand why they're so short. They honestly don't go deep into any detail here. Aside from some extra background information here and there, these really do just play out as summaries of the films for the most part. There's never really a part in either of these where the writing sucks you in, where you see yourself directly in someone else's shoes. And that's because of how simple everything is. Granted, this makes sense. These were written for younger readers after all, but it still makes it hard to recommend at the end of the day. I swear if I wanted to, I could probably read both books in less time than it would take for me to watch their film counterparts. But I digress. Being completely honest, the best part of this book to me wasn't even the novelizations, but the afterword written by Jeffrey Angels. In it, he gives a brief history of Shigeru Kayama, and all of the choices he made during his work on Godzilla. And later, he goes on to mention some of the choices he made in translating the novellas. It's all very interesting stuff, honestly. I don't want to go over all of it here, but there's just one part I have to bring up. It's mentioned that at one point Shigeru Kayama grew disillusioned with where the Godzilla series was heading, seeing people laugh and smile as they watched the monsters fight on screen, and seeing how popular Godzilla was getting with children in general. What was supposed to be a metaphor for nuclear weapons was now being seen as kids' entertainment by most people. It honestly makes me feel a little bad for Kayama. But then, I couldn't help but laugh a bit as well. Y'all, he was having these thoughts in 1955, after only the release of Raids Again. This man lived to 1975, meaning he got to witness scenes like this, and this. Like always, thank you for watching all the way to the end, and until next time, goodbye, y'all.